Imagine a courtroom where a teenage girl stands alone, facing ruthless lawyers and a judge who mocks her. No law degree, no experience, just the truth burning in her heart. They thought she was just a kid, until she opened her mouth. What happened next left the entire courtroom speechless. Where are you watching from? Write it down in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because this story is just getting started. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind you could almost reach out and touch. A place designed for justice, now filled with smug glances and whispered judgments. And right at the center of it all stood Emily Harper, a teenage girl who looked like she had wandered into the wrong room. Her messy ponytail was barely holding together, an oversized sweatshirt draped over her thin frame, and her scuffed sneakers squeaked slightly against the polished floor as she shifted nervously. She didn't look like she belonged there, but that's exactly why this story matters. Across the room, perched high with an air of untouchable authority, sat Judge Marcus Ellington, a man who had made a career out of wielding power with nothing more than words and a gavel. He leaned back in his chair, a smug smile creeping across his face, eyes narrowing at the sight of Emily standing alone. His voice broke the silence, dripping with condescension, the kind that cuts deeper than any insult. "Miss Harper," he began, pausing just long enough to let the mockery sink in. "Do you even know where you are? This is a court of law, not some after-school debate club." Laughter rippled through the courtroom, sharp, cruel, and filled with disbelief. Attorneys in tailored suits exchanged amused glances, shaking their heads as if this was the most entertainment they'd had all week. A teenage girl? In their courtroom? It was a joke to them. Emily's face flushed, the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. She clutched the stack of papers in front of her like a shield, her knuckles turning white. But her eyes told a different story. They didn't dart around the room looking for an escape. No, they locked onto Judge Ellington's gaze, unflinching, unwavering. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't shaky or timid. It was calm, steady, and sharp enough to slice through the arrogance filling the room. "Your Honor," she said, her tone respectful but firm, "I'm fully aware of where I am. Perhaps if you listen, you'll learn something today." The effect was immediate, like flipping a switch. The laughter died mid-chuckle. Pens stopped scribbling. Even the judge, so sure of his control, leaned forward slightly, his smug expression flickering for just a second. Silence fell over the room, but it wasn't the comfortable kind. It was the kind that comes when people realize they've underestimated someone, and that realization hits harder than any gavel ever could. Emily Harper didn't just hold her ground that day, she owned it, and for the first time in that courtroom, it wasn't the judge or the lawyers who commanded respect, it was the girl no one saw coming. The room was still, but not with the same dismissive silence from before. This was different, tense, charged, as if the very air knew something extraordinary was about to happen. Emily Harper stood at the defendant's table, no longer the nervous teenager gripping papers like a lifeline. Her hands were steady now, her voice smooth, carrying the weight of someone who had nothing to prove, yet everything to fight for. She began to speak, not with hesitation, but with precision. Words flowed from her like sharpened blades, legal precedents, constitutional clauses, courtroom procedures, all delivered effortlessly. It wasn't just recitation, it was mastery. She didn't stumble, didn't pause to second guess. She dissected the prosecution's arguments with surgical precision, exposing contradictions like pulling threads from a fragile tapestry until their case began to unravel right before their eyes. The attorneys who had been chuckling moments earlier, their laughter was gone, replaced by the frantic scratching of pens on paper. They leaned forward, furiously taking notes, their smug expressions wiped clean, replaced by something they weren't used to feeling: fear. Fear that they were being outmatched by a teenager. And Judge Marcus Ellington? The same judge who had mocked her with that signature smirk? That smirk had vanished. His eyes narrowed, not in judgment now, but in disbelief. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the polished bench, his gavel forgotten at his side. Unable to hold back any longer, his voice broke through the thick silence. "Who are you?" Emily paused, letting the question hang in the air like a challenge. She looked straight at him, her eyes fierce but calm, steady as a storm gathering strength. Then, with the kind of clarity that silenced whatever doubt remained in the room, she answered. "I'm Emily Harper," she said, her voice strong, "and I'm here to defend my father." The courtroom exploded. Gasps echoed against the walls, whispers spread like wildfire, and disbelief rippled through the crowd. Some leaned in, as if hearing her name again might make more sense the second time. Others sat back, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. She wasn't an intern, not some bold teenager playing pretend. She was a daughter, fighting not just against a legal system, but against every expectation, every dismissal, every assumption that she didn't belong. And in that moment, Emily Harper didn't just defend her father. She redefined what it meant to stand alone and win. Before the courtroom gasps, before the legal brilliance and sharp rebuttals, there was just Emily Harper, a teenager sitting in a dimly lit bedroom, drowning in silence louder than any courtroom applause could ever be. 2 years earlier, her world had shattered like glass hitting concrete. Her father, Nathan Harper, was arrested, accused of corporate fraud. One headline, one set of handcuffs, and everything changed. He wasn't just her dad anymore. He was a criminal in the eyes of the world. The man who had once tucked her in with bedtime stories now sat behind cold metal bars, his fate sealed by an overworked public defender who treated his case like a number, not a life. Emily watched it all unfold, how quickly people turned their backs, how easily justice could be just a word, hollow and meaningless. But grief has a way of carving out space inside you, space for something else to grow. For Emily, that space filled with something unexpected: fire. While other kids her age scrolled through social media, she scrolled through legal databases. While her classmates memorized history dates, she memorized constitutional clauses. She devoured law books like novels, her late nights lit not by party lights, but by the dim glow of a desk lamp flickering over pages filled with legal jargon. Podcasts on courtroom strategies became her soundtrack. Free online law courses? She didn't just enroll, she dominated. Not because anyone told her to, but because no one believed she could. But this wasn't just about her father anymore. It was about every sideways glance from neighbors who pitied her, every teacher who spoke softer like she might break, every "she's just a kid" whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. Emily wasn't trying to prove them wrong. She was trying to prove herself right. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't invisible. She was a force waiting to be unleashed. And when the day finally came for her to step into that courtroom, she didn't walk in as a lost teenager desperate to save her father. She walked in as the result of 2 years of silent battles fought in the shadows. A prodigy forged not in privilege, but in pain. And the courtroom was about to learn that the hardest person to silence is someone who's been unheard for far too long. The courtroom buzzed with an uneasy tension, the kind that settles in when people realize the rules of the game have changed, but they're still trying to play by the old ones. Emily Harper stood at the center of it all, her posture steady, her eyes sharp, as if the courtroom itself was her battlefield, and every word was a weapon she knew exactly how to use. Across from her, Mr. Richard Vaughn, the prosecutor with a reputation carved from ruthless cross-examinations and a career built on winning, not justice. He was the kind of man who smiled without warmth, whose words were wrapped in legal jargon sharp enough to slice through the truth without anyone noticing. But Emily noticed. She waited patiently, as Vaughn strutted through his opening arguments, presenting evidence with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Photos, timelines, financial records, all delivered with theatrical flair, as if performance could substitute for facts. And then it was Emily's turn. She stepped forward, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. No hesitation, no fear, just that quiet, simmering determination. "Mr. Vaughn," she began, her voice calm, but with an undertone of steel, "you've presented a compelling story, but that's all it is, a story." She moved to the evidence table, lifting a document Vaughn had highlighted with great dramatic effect just moments earlier. "This financial report," she said, holding it up, "claims to show discrepancies in my father's accounts. But what you conveniently left out is that these numbers were pulled from incomplete records, records missing key transactions that completely change the narrative." The courtroom shifted, a ripple of surprise. Vaughn's smirk faltered for the briefest second. She continued, dismantling each piece of evidence like she was peeling back layers of deception. Emails. She pointed out timestamps that didn't align with security logs. Financial statements. She traced transactions to sources Vaughn had never even mentioned. Witness testimonies. She highlighted contradictions Vaughn hoped no one would catch. It was a masterclass, not in arrogance, not in showmanship, in truth. Vaughn tried to interrupt, his voice tinged with frustration, but Emily didn't flinch. She met him head-on, her arguments airtight, her logic unshakable. Judge Marcus Ellington, who had once mocked her with smug remarks, now shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His pride bruised, his authority challenged, not by a seasoned lawyer, but by a teenager he'd dismissed as a child. He cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension. "Miss Harper," he said, his tone sharper now, trying to reclaim control, "while your enthusiasm is noted, do you truly believe you're qualified to stand here without any formal legal training?" The courtroom held its breath. Emily paused, letting the weight of the question hang in the air. Then she stepped forward, her gaze locked on the judge, her voice steady as ever. "Your Honor," she said, "if justice relies solely on a degree, then maybe the system needs more than just lawyers." Silence, the kind that vibrates. Because in that moment, Emily Harper didn't just challenge a prosecutor, she challenged an entire system. Just as Emily's arguments carved through the courtroom like a blade, the doors at the back of the room slammed open with a force that made everyone flinch. The sound echoed, slicing through the tension like a gavel striking down, but this time it wasn't the judge in control. A man strode in, his tailored suit crisp, every step radiating authority. Mr. Calvin Rhodes. His polished shoes clicked against the floor with a rhythm that seemed intentional, like each step was meant to announce his presence before he even spoke. His sharp gaze swept across the room, landing squarely on Emily with the precision of a predator locking onto its target. Without waiting for permission, he addressed the judge, his voice smooth, confident, and dripping with the kind of entitlement that doesn't ask, it expects. "Your Honor," he began, flashing credentials like a weapon, "I'm Calvin Rhodes, representing the Bar Association. I've been informed of an unauthorized individual attempting to practice law in this courtroom." Murmurs erupted like wildfire, spreading through the crowd. The same attorneys who had been scrambling to keep up with Emily's arguments now exchanged smug, satisfied looks. Finally, a way to discredit her, not through skill or facts, but through the very system she was fighting against. Emily's face tightened, her breath hitching just for a second, just long enough for Rhodes to notice, and for his thin smile to grow. "Miss Harper," he continued, turning to her like a lion addressing a lamb, "you are not a licensed attorney. You have no legal standing here. This isn't a debate club, this is a court of law, and you are in violation of it." Judge Ellington leaned back, clearly eager to regain the control Emily had stripped from him. His fingers drummed on the bench, the hint of a smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth as if to say, I knew this would happen. But Emily didn't crumble. She stepped forward, her voice steady, though her heart raced like a drum inside her chest. "Your Honor," she began, her eyes locking onto the judge's with a fierce intensity. "I may not have a law degree, I may not have a license, but what I do have is the truth. And while we argue about credentials, an innocent man's life is hanging in the balance, my father's life." The courtroom fell into a tense silence, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone. She wasn't fighting for recognition. She was fighting for survival. Judge Ellington shifted uncomfortably, the smugness fading into something harder to define. Perhaps guilt, perhaps doubt. He cleared his throat, glancing between Rhodes and Emily, torn between his disdain for her audacity and the undeniable brilliance she'd displayed. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed heavily. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice gruff, "I will allow you to proceed, temporarily. But be very clear, if I find that you're wasting this court's time, I will hold you in contempt." Emily nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face, but only for a heartbeat, because she knew this wasn't a victory. It was just borrowed time. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs during the brief recess, the air still thick with tension after Emily's fierce defense. She stood near the defendant's table, her papers neatly stacked, but her mind anything but organized. The cracks in her confidence, hidden so well beneath sharp arguments and legal jargon, were beginning to show. Her hands trembled slightly, the weight of the case, the judgmental stares, and her own fear pressing down like invisible chains. And then, just when the silence felt unbearable, the doors creaked open, not with the dramatic flair of a legal authority, but with the soft shuffle of small footsteps. A young boy, no older than 10, darted into the courtroom, clutching a crumpled envelope tightly in his hand. His name was Liam, Emily's little brother. His face was flushed, his breathing quick from running. Before anyone could stop him, he raced to Emily's side, thrusting the envelope into her hands with wide, earnest eyes. "You forgot this," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of excitement and fear. Emily stared at the envelope, her fingers hesitating for a moment. She recognized it instantly, the familiar handwriting scrawled across the front, delicate but firm. It was her mother's handwriting, a letter she had tucked away, unopened, afraid of the emotions it might unleash. But now, there was no hiding. She slowly peeled it open, her heart pounding louder than any gavel strike. The courtroom seemed to fade into the background as her eyes scanned the words. "Dear Emily, if you're reading this, it means life has tested you in ways I never wanted it to, but I know you. You are stronger than fear, braver than doubt, and smarter than anyone who dares to underestimate you. When the world feels too heavy, remember this. You carry not just your father's hopes, but mine too. Don't let them define you. Show them who you are." Tears welled up, blurring the ink for a brief moment, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall because, for the first time in weeks, they weren't just tears of fear. They were fuel. When court resumed, Emily wasn't the same girl who had stood there hours ago, desperate to prove herself. She was someone who no longer cared about proving anything. She was there to fight. And fight she did. With renewed resolve, Emily tore into the prosecution's case with laser focus. But the deeper she dug, the more she uncovered. Financial records led to suspicious transactions. Emails hinted at connections that had nothing to do with her father's alleged crime. It wasn't just sloppy evidence, it was deliberate. A conspiracy. Mr. Richard Vaughn, the cold, ruthless prosecutor, wasn't just interested in winning, he was protecting something. Or rather, someone. And Calvin Rhodes? His presence wasn't about courtroom integrity. He was there to keep Emily from getting too close to the truth. Piece by piece, Emily unraveled the tangled web. The company accusing her father of fraud had ties to both Vaughn and Rhodes, payments disguised as consulting fees. legal loopholes exploited to silence whistleblowers, documents buried under layers of red tape, all pointing to one undeniable fact. Her father wasn't just framed, he was a scapegoat. The courtroom transformed from a trial about corporate fraud into something far more dangerous, a battle against systemic corruption. The judge, once dismissive, now leaned forward, listening not with skepticism, but with genuine concern. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they weren't just witnesses to a case, they were witnesses to a cover-up. Emily stood there, her voice unwavering, her mother's words echoing in her heart. She wasn't just defending her father anymore. She was exposing the truth, and the truth was louder than any courtroom could contain. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that feels like it's pressing against your chest, heavy and unrelenting. Emily Harper stood firm, her voice having carved cracks into the prosecution's once impenetrable case. But even she didn't expect what was about to happen next. Just as she finished dismantling yet another flawed argument, the back doors of the courtroom burst open with a loud bang. All heads turned sharply toward the commotion. A man stood there, disheveled, sweat beading on his forehead, his hands clutching a small USB drive like it was his last lifeline. His name was David Sloan, a former employee of the very corporation accusing Emily's father. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the room filled with powerful figures who had once controlled his silence. But then he stepped forward, his voice trembling yet determined. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "I have evidence that proves Nathan Harper is innocent." Gasps erupted. Whispers rippled through the courtroom like waves crashing against the walls. Judge Ellington's gavel slammed down, demanding order, but his voice couldn't compete with the growing chaos. "Order!" the judge bellowed, banging the gavel again, his face flushed with confusion and frustration. "Who are you, and what do you think you're doing interrupting this court?" David's hands shook as he held up the USB. "My name is David Sloan. I used to work for Titan Corporation. I was part of the cover-up. I can't stay silent anymore." Emily's heart raced. She didn't know this man, but his words felt like a lifeline thrown in the middle of a storm. The judge, trying to regain control, motioned for the bailiff to retrieve the USB. "Bring it here," he ordered, suspicion and curiosity battling in his voice. As the contents of the drive were projected onto the courtroom screens, the room fell into a stunned silence once more. Emails, financial records, internal communications that detailed fraudulent activities, not by Nathan Harper, but by high-ranking officials within Titan Corp. The evidence laid bare the conspiracy to frame Nathan, all to protect the company's real culprits. And it didn't stop there. Tucked within the files were documents linking Mr. Richard Vaughn, the prosecutor himself, to the corporation. Payments disguised as consulting fees, correspondence suggesting legal favors in exchange for ensuring Nathan's conviction. Vaughn's face turned from smug confidence to pale disbelief, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Attorneys argued over each other, voices rising, some demanding an immediate mistrial, others calling for Vaughn's arrest. The judge's gavel pounded furiously. "Order in the court," Judge Ellington roared, his face now a mixture of rage and disbelief. His authority, once unquestioned, was now fragile amid the storm of corruption unfolding before him. Emily stood frozen for a moment, the weight of it all sinking in. Then she turned her gaze to Vaughn, who avoided her eyes, his composure shattered. She didn't need to say it out loud. The truth had spoken, and there was no silencing it now. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt like the entire room was holding its breath. All eyes were on Emily Harper as she stood, her hands resting lightly on the defendant's table, the weight of the case and her entire journey settling on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, her voice steady, but rich with emotion, as she began her closing argument. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she started, her gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had doubted her, mocked her, dismissed her. This case was never just about corporate fraud. It was never just about financial records, legal jargon, or courtroom procedures. This case was about truth. She paused, letting her words settle into the hearts of everyone listening. We've heard a lot in this courtroom: testimonies, accusations, evidence twisted to fit narratives. But beneath all of that noise, there's a simple, undeniable fact. My father is innocent. And the real crime here isn't just what was done to him. It's how easy it was to let it happen. Her voice grew stronger, each word hitting with the force of someone who wasn't just fighting a legal battle, but fighting for her very soul. Justice isn't about age. It isn't about titles. It's not about power, or who wears the nicest suit, or who can shout the loudest in court. Justice is about the truth. And today, she stepped forward, her eyes fierce. The truth has spoken. The room remained still for a heartbeat, then another. And then it happened. The once dismissive crowd, the same people who had laughed at her, now erupted, not with mockery, but with applause. The sound was overwhelming, a wave of validation crashing over Emily. She didn't smile. She didn't bask in the moment. She simply stood there, letting it wash over her, knowing she had done exactly what she came to do. Judge Marcus Ellington, the man who had belittled her from the very start, cleared his throat, his face devoid of the smug arrogance he once wore like a badge. He leaned forward, his gavel resting in his hand, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of what true justice looked like. This court finds Nathan Harper not guilty. The words echoed through the room, louder than any gavel ever could. Emily felt her knees weaken slightly, not from defeat, but from the overwhelming rush of relief. Her father stood, tears in his eyes, pulling her into an embrace that spoke louder than any words ever could. As the room slowly cleared, Judge Ellington approached her, his steps measured, his pride swallowed. "Miss Harper," he said quietly, "you've taught me more about justice today than I've learned in all my years on this bench." Emily met his gaze, nodded once, and simply replied, "It was never about me. It was about the truth." Weeks later, letters arrived. Law schools offering her scholarships, news outlets wanting interviews. She read them, smiled politely, but left them unanswered, because Emily Harper wasn't done yet. She didn't need a title to fight for what was right. She didn't need a degree to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. She already had the most powerful thing anyone could carry into a courtroom: courage, and that was enough. If Emily's story inspired you, like, subscribe, and share this video. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. What does justice mean to you? We'd love to hear your story.